Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
You are about to see is a masterclass in how to corner a witness who is used to giving Washington answers. When Kash Patel sat down for this hearing, the room thought they knew the script. They expected the usual back and forth about agency funding and FBI budgets. But what happened next was something nobody on that committee expected. Senator Jeff Merkley didn't just ask about policy. He started asking questions that began to expose the entire narrative of equal treatment under the law. He didn't start with a question about crime or borders. He started with the one thing that is supposed to protect every single person on American soil: the Fifth Amendment. Merkley calls it the Freedom Clause, and for a very specific reason. It was written when our nation was only 4 years old because the founders knew we needed protection from an over-aggressive government that might try to take away our life, liberty, or property without due process. I'm telling you now, you need to watch this until the very end, because the moment that broke the entire room, the question that left the witness visibly scrambling, wasn't about a budget cut. It was a question about the very foundation of our republic. Hit subscribe real quick, because this reveal is one you cannot afford to miss. Now, watch how Merkley sets the trap.
Senator Merkley.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Director Patel. And so, as I understood it, you testified yesterday that you'd like to have another $1 billion added on to the FY25 level to do the additional work you'd like to do on drug interdiction, fentanyl in general, and anti-terrorism. And today you gave us a budget that requests cutting $500 million. Which is it? Do you want us to, what are you asking of this committee? To add funds, add $1 billion, or to cut $500 million?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission, and am in support of the budget here, and I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts $500 million, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed, because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay. Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today, so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Mm-hmm. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the Freedom Clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over where they're an investigation?
You hear that? The director of the FBI is asked a simple question. Does it concern you that hundreds of people were swept off the streets and sent out of the country without their day in court? And his response? I'm not in a position to comment. This is where we have to stop and look at the legal stakes. This isn't just a debate for lawyers. This matters for every single American. The Fifth Amendment doesn't say due process for some citizens. The sources show that Merkley is highlighting the plain language of the Constitution, which applies to all persons in the United States. If the government can decide that one group of people doesn't get due process today, what stops them from deciding you don't get it tomorrow? This is the over-aggressive government the founders warned us about. But it gets even more concerning. When Patel is asked if he has even launched an investigation into these potential violations of the Freedom Clause, he says he doesn't agree with the characterization. He claims he agrees with the Constitution, but then says, "It is not for me to call the balls and strikes." Think about that. The man who wants to lead the FBI, the nation's premier law enforcement agency, is saying it's not his job to decide if the Constitution is being followed. He says his job is just to investigate criminal acts, but he refuses to investigate what the senator is calling a major violation of the highest law in the land. The analysis here is simple but serious. If the people in power treat the Constitution like a smokescreen or just a constitutional question for another branch to handle, then our rights are not truly protected. They become just suggestions.
Have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution?
It says
all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says
doesn't
no person.
say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status. The Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. But it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government. So
if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you since you're...
I'm not a constitutional scholar. That is the answer we are getting from the top of our justice system. Merkley hits him with the ultimate reality check. You don't need to be a scholar. You just have to read the plain language of the document you took an oath to uphold. The senator points out that the Supreme Court has been clear for decades. The right to due process is for all individuals. Yet the witness insists on waiting to hear from the Supreme Court before deciding whether he will investigate these actions. This is the oldest trick in the book. When the elite don't want to answer for their actions, they hide behind bureaucracy. They treat the Constitution like something complicated that only scholars can understand, instead of the Freedom Clause that protects everyone. Merkley's frustration is palpable because he sees the moral of the story. We are witnessing a system where the core protections of freedom are being treated as optional. It's the same philosophy we've seen elsewhere. If the wealthy and powerful break the rules, they get a multi-million-dollar parting gift or a bailout. But if you're an average person caught in the system, you're on your own. This exchange is a sobering window into the state of our justice system. When a leader says they won't make the call on constitutional rights, they are saying your liberty can be negotiated. The question that changed the temperature of the room wasn't just about deportations, it was about the oath of office. Will the head of the FBI send the message that due process must be followed, or will they treat our fundamental rights as a constitutional question that isn't their problem to solve? We are being told to wait for the truth and wait for the courts, while the people in power continue to act beyond the limits. But as Senator Merkley made clear, the Constitution isn't a suggestion, it's the law. What do you think? Is "I'm not a constitutional scholar" an acceptable answer for the head of the FBI? Or is the Freedom Clause being ignored to serve a political agenda? Let me know in the comments.